one of the unique aspects of our program is also dealing with the frontal lobe, as was kind of mentioned by Katie. And the frontal lobe, if Guyton's textbook of physiology mentions that the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. And there's many programs for improving the brain that totally ignore the frontal lobe of the brain. Many psychologists, in fact, the field that is most rift with agnosticism and atheism is the psychiatric field. And so the spiritual part is just off limits to this group. But yet, it's very clear from the study of physiology and neuroanatomy that the frontal lobe is crucial in order to improve mental health. You saw those SPECT scans yesterday of the regional blood flow, the before and after difference. And so, but there's more even practical reasons to consider the spiritual. Thank you. So this is, our goal for our participants is not just to be depression-free and anxiety-free and possibly even medication-free. The goal is to be free of a mental illness we are all challenged with. I didn't fully understand this back when I was a young physician in 1991. I'm going to date myself here, but I had already finished my specialty training. I was already teaching, and now I had set up a private practice in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and was the director of an intensive care unit there. And so I was admitting people to ICU, intubating them, doing all these procedures on them, admitting people to hospitals. And the number one reason in 1991 that I was admitting people to the hospital and intensive care unit, anyone want to guess what it is? It's kind of the clue there on the screen. Coronary artery disease and heart disease, heart attacks, congestive heart failure. These things were very commonplace in 1991, and a conference title crossed my desk. In Tucson, Arizona, they were going to be putting on in October of that year the first international conference on the elimination of coronary artery disease. And I thought, wow, this is pretty brave. It's not talking about just preventing it, it's talking about what? Eliminating it. And I at first thought, well, I wonder if these are quacks that are doing this. But then I looked. It was people from University of California, San Francisco. It was people from Cornell. It was people from peer-reviewed researchers that were well respected around the world. And I thought, wow, this is going to be foundational. And so I decided to clear my schedule to go to Tucson, Arizona. Our first child was just 2 months old, but he took his first airplane flight with us. And those were back in the days when, clunky, large video cameras were the thing. And they didn't have rules against videoing then. They had just kind of come out. So I had one of these clunky video cameras filming everything that was going on. And I was really excited about what I was hearing, and I thought, boy, this will be great to share with my patients and help them eliminate their coronary artery disease. And as speaker after speaker came and presented the evidence, I thought, I'm a young physician, I'm going to be able to see remarkable changes within my career. Heart disease is the #1 killer in America now, but I'm just going to guess the fact that these researchers are so famous and have done such a good job that maybe give me 25 years and we'll look back, and if I'm seeing a heart attack then, I'll take a medical student with me and I'll tell him this is what I used to see every day and you might only see this once in your lifetime. This is what I used to treat on a regular basis, because coronary artery disease has all been but eliminated. That's what I truly thought would be the case. But it turns out the number one cause of death, even during the COVID years, was what? It was not COVID. It was coronary artery disease. Still, the number one killer. Now, it had gone down a little bit for those who had paid attention and changed their lifestyle accordingly, but still, thousands of people. You know, we used to talk about preventing COVID. In fact, I even got a question about that, you know. What can we do to prevent COVID? There's a lot more we can do to prevent the number one killer. Thousands of people dying every day from a totally preventable and eliminating a disease that could be eliminated. And so why the world has not changed that much is not due to lack of good scientific information. We now know that what they were saying is even more true than back when the evidence was there in 1991. This disease can be completely eliminated. So it's not due to lack of good science. Sometimes we think we just need more scientific advancements. Not in this case. It's actually due to a mental illness that is prevalent in almost every person in the world. This mental illness is even more prevalent than depression and anxiety. Anyone want to guess what that mental illness is? It has something to do with it. Lack of self-control. Self-control is our ability to keep ourselves from acting on our behavioral or emotional impulses. According to a recent review by Baumeister, Roy Baumeister is now the most quoted researcher in the world. He actually is teaches psychology at Stanford. There in the Bay Area, for those of you that know California, there is something called the Bay Area, where you, of course, have San Francisco Bay. On the other side of the bay is Oakland, and on the south end of that bay is a city called San Jose. And right at the Bay Area, even closer to the bay, is Palo Alto, which is where Stanford is at. And Baumeister says self-control failure is central to nearly all the personal and social problems that currently plague citizens of the modern developed world. In fact, he calls it the number one problem in all of the world. Now, you'd think the most quoted researcher calling that, we would have actually discourses about this. In politics, we'd have presidents mentioning it. We would have Congress mentioning it. But interestingly, the current president has never mentioned this problem. The past president has never mentioned this problem. There's not even been a committee in Congress to discuss it. They'll talk about problems, but they ignore the number one problem in all of the world. It's the elephant in the room. Perhaps they ignore it because they have it on full display. But nonetheless, lack of self-control, speaking of Baumeister, he makes a convincing case. When we know how to prevent heart disease and eliminate it, but it's still the number one killer in the world, it's not heart disease that's the problem. It's a disease of the mind. It's lack of self-control. Diabetes, is that going up or going down? It's going up considerably. Yes, genetics loads the gun, but it's lifestyle that pulls the trigger. You can have the gene for type 2 diabetes and never get it if you just follow the lifestyle that will prevent it from happening. But yet diabetes is becoming more rampant. It's exponentially going up throughout the world. Why is it going up? It's not diabetes, it's lack of self-control. Sexually transmitted diseases. I remember back in the 1990s, some liberal academics came out with this small study that they publicized greatly, and they were well connected with Congress and legislators. And they made the statement that if we would just make pornography widely available and condoms widely available, we would be able to eliminate both rape and sexually transmitted diseases. So they did that. And what do you think happened? Rape went way up, and sexually transmitted diseases are at an all-time high. By the way, none of those liberal academics came out and apologized to the world for what they had done. But yet, sexually transmitted disease, yeah, we all know how to prevent it, but it's not, it's rising because of lack of self-control. Stroke, 80% of strokes would be preventable if we would put into action what is best. Alcoholism, by definition, the alcoholic knows it's harmful for him, but he can't get away from it. Murder rates. I don't know what's happening here in Australia, but last year murder rates went up higher from one year to the next than ever before in U.S. history. What's going on? Lack of self-control. We talked about rape. Depression. Now, when a person comes through our program, and they put into practice nutrition and lifestyle measures and thinking measures that greatly help them and they overcome depression and anxiety. If they get it again, what do you think it's going to be due to? Lack of self-control. This is why this is a very important presentation before they go into re-entry, for them to have long-term success. Harvard says 80% of cancers are preventable if we would put into practice what is best. And so cancer is the number 2 cause of death. Even during COVID, cancer was the number 2 cause of death. But yet most of those cancers were completely preventable if we had self-control. Unwanted pregnancies, by definition, lack of self-control. Adultery and divorce, most often, adultery and divorce is going to be due to lack of self-control of someone, if not both people in that relationship. Underachievement. Colleges and universities are accepting students with high GPAs and high SAT or ACT scores, and then they get to college and they're not able to do it. They're able, but they're not doing it. Why are they not performing? Lack of self-control. They're up on their phones at night. They're watching movies. They're doing other things that are not related to academics. Financial failure, often due to lack of self-control. Relationship problems, often due to lack of self-control. Technology addiction, perhaps the number 1 addiction in the world now. Technology addiction. People know it's not good for them. They're not handling it well, but they can't get away from it. Lack of self-control. Now that's just a partial list, but you can imagine if we put all this up there, why Baumeister makes the case. This is the number 1 problem in all the world. But it's not a new problem. Paul talked about it. He said, I don't really understand myself. I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. There's another power within me that is at war with my mind. This power makes me a slave to sin that is still within me. And then perhaps one of the most saddest texts in all of the Bible, he says this, "Oh, what a miserable and wretched person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death?" This describes a whole host of the world today. They know what's better for them, but they're not doing it. They know what's bad for them, and they find themselves doing it. And anyone who is in that condition is wretched and miserable. And if they don't think they are, they will become, because the effects of that are going to catch up with them in ways they have no control over. And a lot of pain and misery and suffering is coming their way. There's only one other place in the Bible. In fact, there's at least it's the most famous Christian hymn in America. I don't know if it's the most famous Christian hymn in Australia. Have you heard of the hymn Amazing Grace over here? How sweet the sound that saved a what? A wretch like me. So this is what it's talking about, someone who doesn't have self-control. But there's only one other place in the Bible that term wretched is mentioned. Does anyone know where it's mentioned? Yes, the pastor knew in the front row. I'm impressed with your pastor. Revelation 3:17. This is the last message to the church of Laodicea. There are 7 churches. By the way, if you ever have the opportunity, it's not this year, next year, Weimar University does a tour of the 7 churches. We have one of our church religion professors who knows 7 languages, and he's a church history person, and he will take you in succession to every one of those churches. And by the way, the book of Revelation, if you don't understand it, it will open up to you, because he has a brilliant analysis where he realizes the 7 seals are actually connected to the 7 churches. The first seal is the first church. Second seal, those are promises of what will happen to you if you heed the recommendations of Christ for that church. And the trumpets are the warning for each of those 7 churches. There's 7 trumpets, and the trumpets are a warning in regards to if you just go the way of culture and you ignore the recommendations of Christ, what's going to end up happening. And of course, it opens up the entire book. The trumpets actually don't end till Revelation 16 is actually part of that 7th trumpet. And so it really opens up the book to you. But I've actually been on that tour. And the last church we went to was Laodicea. It's a beautiful church. And even today, you'll walk in and realize this was a tremendous, wealthy church. And it's in a beautiful location, and it was in a city that was obsessed with 2 things, at least 2 things. Obviously, they were obsessed with money. That would be a 3rd thing. But in that city, they had live theaters running all the time, and there were 2 huge theaters that were there. So acting, Hollywood, those types of things, Laodicea was big on it. The second thing they were big on was sports. They had the largest sporting arenas in the known world, and they had those going. So sports and Hollywood and money describe Laodicea. And Christ had commendations for a lot of churches. He didn't really have commendations for Laodicea, but he did have recommendations. He said, "You say I have become rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know." Maybe that's a little bit of a commendation. At least they were ignorant of it. "Do not know that you are" what? "Wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and what else? Naked." They think they're in pretty good shape. But we just found out what the definition of wretched was in the Bible. These people do not have self-control. They might have money. They might be going to sporting events. They might even be a sports hero. They might even be a Hollywood acting hero. But they're wretched. And they're also naked. What's the symbolism of naked? What is it that they don't have? They don't have the robe of Christ's righteousness. What does that mean? That means if we don't find the solution to our self-control problems, that could have eternal consequences. Those are the words of Christ himself. And so the question is, what is the secret to avoiding this wretchedness? First, I'll tell you what secular science tells us is the secret, because they've been studying self-control recently. They recognize it's a very, very important subject. And they tell us the answer is temperance. Now, being from Weimar, now Weimar University in the United States, Weimar is known by an acronym called New Start. Any of you have heard of New Start? And so people that come there, they come to get a new start on life. And the N stands for nutrition, the E, exercise, the W, water, the S, Sunlight, one of the advantages of Weimar, even though it's in a beautiful area, it gets 330 days of sun per year. And a lot of greenery still around. The first T is, there it is, temperance. So Weimar is all about temperance. The A is for air, fresh air. The R is for rest. And the final T is for trust in divine power. And so Weimar is all about temperance. What is temperance? It's moderation in things that are healthy and abstinence in the things that are unhealthy. That's all it is. And strict temperance requires what type of self-control? Comprehensive self-control. Now, as I go around the world, as you know, I'm from California, and as I go around the world, I will ask people, have you ever heard of a governor of the state of California? Does anyone know who the most famous governor is of the state of California? Yes, I'm hearing. I heard some Ronald Reagans, a few decades ago. He might have been the most famous. Former president, and he was governor of California before that. But this guy, the current culture doesn't know Ronald Reagan at all. And so the one that's the most famous governor ever is a governor by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger. How did Arnold Schwarzenegger become famous? It wasn't Hollywood. Before Hollywood, bodybuilding, Mr. Universe. Does it require meticulous self-control to build up muscles the way Arnold did? Oh yes, you've got to be at the gym when you don't want to be at the gym. You've got to be taking the right supplements. You've got to be eating the right diet. No pain, no gain. Meticulous self-control to build up those muscles. But did Arnold have comprehensive self-control? It's very clear he did not. During the time when he was doing all of that, when his maid was cleaning his house, he lacked comprehensive self-control, and he ended up losing the love of his life due to not having comprehensive self-control. I kept it a secret for a while, about 18 years, and then 18 years later, son shows up and says, "Hi, Daddy." And Maria, his wife, is saying, "What? What? You did this 18 years ago? You never gave any idea behind this? You have betrayed me. I can't stay with you." He begged her, "Please, I love you. Please stay with me." And it became very clear that he would have rather not been Mr. Universe. He would have rather not been the Terminator. He would have rather not even been the governor of the state of California if he would have been able to keep his wife, Maria. But he lost the love of his life due to not having comprehensive self-control. I actually gave this talk about 6 weeks ago at a clinic there at Weimar. We have a big clinic that sees about 40,000 patients a year. And as I was giving this lecture, a secretary that works in the governor's mansion in California was present. And I didn't know that she was Arnold's secretary when he was there. She's also the secretary of the first governor, of the current governor. And she said, "Dr. Nedley, he really needs to hear this lecture because his lack of self-control was not just in that area. There was a whole lot of areas that he does not have self-control on, and he needs to know the secret to all of this." So, back to the secular science. This is a review article on temperance. In our endeavor to measure this class of strengths, we have found that among people in the mainstream developed world, strengths of temperance are infrequently endorsed and seldom praised. In other words, the world doesn't really honor people that are temperate. But they go on to say this: Regardless, the strengths of temperance are very important, and they have a rich array of positive consequences for the what? The psychological good life. Now, as we are sitting here this morning, there's not a human being on the planet that doesn't want to live the good life. Everyone is after the good life, but very few people know how to get there. And the secular science is telling us the way to get there is to become a temperate person. Become a person that has comprehensive self-control, and it will open the door for everyone to experience the good life. Now, how do they know this? Well, they've been studying it. In order to study something, you have to measure it. And in order to measure it, they give people a self-control test. If you state this, getting up in the morning is hard for me, is that high self-control or low self-control? Getting up in the morning is hard for me means that you would be rated as low self-control on that question. How about this? I blurt out whatever is on my mind. Low or high? That's low. I have a hard time breaking bad habits. Low. I do certain things that are bad for me if they are fun. Low self-control, I get carried away by my feelings. That's low self-control. By the way, we talked about that. What type of distortion is that? We talked about it last night when you get carried away by your feelings. It's called emotional reasoning. Very common in today's world, and an emotional reasoner is not going to have good self-control. I do many things on the spur of the moment. That's low self-control. I spend too much money. Low self-control. I keep everything neat. What would that be? High self-control. All right. I'm wondering if the Aussies are awake here this morning. I hear just a few people saying high and low. Let's see if you can think a little faster, and let's see if you can have a chorus here of either high or low on this next question. I don't keep secrets very well. Low. All right, good. I often interrupt people. Low. I'm always on time. High. I have trouble saying no. Low self-control. I'm not easily discouraged. High self-control. I eat healthy foods. High self-control. Pleasure and fun sometimes keep me from getting work done. Low self-control. I have trouble concentrating. Low self-control. Sometimes I can't stop myself from doing something even if I know it's wrong. Low self-control. I'm able to work effectively towards long-term goals. That's high self-control. Now, that's not the complete test, but you get an idea of what they are testing. And then after they score that, they will follow the scores of people. And of course, since these are university professors, you know who they're testing. It's students that are taking this. And they follow these students over the course of a long period of time, and they find out people with high self-control have better personality adjustment. They have higher sense of self-worth. They're better at controlling their anger. They have fewer symptoms of obsessive-compulsive patterns, depression, anxiety, hostile anger, phobias, paranoia, and even psychotic tendencies. In addition, people with high self-control accept themselves as valuable, worthy individuals and are able to sustain this favorable view of self across time and circumstances. But this occurs without registering inflated or narcissistic views of self. So they have a high sense of self-worth, but they don't think themselves better than other people. They're not arrogant or narcissists about it. People with high self-control are more conscientious, more emotionally stable, make better relationship partners, get along better with other people. They're more accommodating, not less accommodating. They report more satisfying relationships, and they have better adjustment in their relationships. In addition, they have better family cohesiveness, less interpersonal conflict, better perspective, and better empathy. They don't wallow in their own personal reactions to other people's problems. They have more secure interpersonal attachments. They manage money well, they spend less, and they save more. In fact, this item of self-control is so important that I told my university students, before you seriously date someone, you need to give them a self-control test. And you ought to take the test yourself. And our student association president took me up on it. He was starting to date a young girl, and he decided before he went further, he would administer her the self-control test, and he took it as well. They both scored very high, and they're getting married this August. And I think it will be a very good marriage if they stay with their comprehensive self-control. But here's what else they say. In the course of daily life, in spite of their best efforts at self-control, people inevitably do what? Sin and transgress, at least on rare occasion. Now, you need to understand these are secular psychologists, but notice the terms that they're mentioning here. They say that even the high self-control people mess up, at least on rare occasion. Now, notice what happens when that occurs. People with high self-control, when they mess up, score relatively low in shame and high in shame-free guilt. What does that mean? Individuals with high self-control are inclined to take responsibility for their transgressions rather than externalizing the blame or minimizing the importance of the transgression. So in other words, when low self-control people mess up, they're not going to blame themselves. They're going to blame who? They're going to blame others, or they're going to say, you know what, this is no big deal. This is just a little thing. Everybody does it. Why is someone, thinking that this is important at all? But in short, having done wrong, high self-control people are inclined to focus on the effects of their behavior, and in so doing are inclined to do what? Make amends. In other words, even though they're high self-control and they mess up, they're going to become better. They're going to take responsibility for messing up, and they're going to improve. In contrast, low self-control individuals are more apt to experience painful feelings of shame, an emotion that often provokes the two Ds. What are the two Ds? Defensiveness and denial, rather than the two R's that the high self-control people go to when they mess up, and that is repair and redemption. Now, I mentioned last night my father was a wise man, and I remember when I was a kid growing up, he says, Neil, you're going to notice two groups of people. One person will have 1 year's experience 20 times over repeated, and another person will have 20 years experience and grow and become a better person through those 20 years. Now, he didn't know all of these psychological terms, but essentially what he was telling me are these two groups of people, the low self-control people and the high self-control people. So the secular science has also looked at, can you have too much self-control? It's a good question because you can even drink too much water. Most people, they're not drinking enough water. But too much water can cause problems. Too much exercise can cause problems. We have a race by Weimar. It's the most grueling race known to mankind. It's called the 100-mile race, where you start in the Sierra Mountains, you go 18,000 feet up and 23,000 feet down. By the way, I should tell you about an Aussie who ran that race. I can tell you about him because I took care of him at the end of that 100-mile race. He actually showed up at the little medical tent, totally exhausted. 32-year-old farmer here in Australia. And they said, go home, go to your hotel, you'll be okay. You have to win a lottery, actually, to run this race, and you've had to run a 100-mile race before, so there's a lot of people competing for this most grueling test of mankind in regards to exercise. And where I saw him was the next morning. He couldn't even walk to get on the plane in Sacramento, so his wife brought him to the emergency room, and he's in complete heart block, heart rate going about 20 beats a minute, low blood pressure, and we're trying to find out why is this young man after a race in complete heart block. And then the lab started coming back. His potassium was 8, extremely high. The potassium was causing him to, high potassium was causing him to go into complete heart block. Why does he have such high potassium? Well, then his CPK, his muscle enzymes, came back well over 100,000, and they were having to dilute it. Normal is less than 100. His was 100,000, meaning that he had lysed, his muscle membranes had been so overtaxed that he had opened up the muscle membranes. All that potassium and myoglobin was going out, and when myoglobin gets in the bloodstream, it plugs the kidneys, and his kidneys were in complete failure. We had to give him calcium, IV calcium, to counteract the high potassium, and his heart rate came right back up again. Then we had to, unfortunately, put him on dialysis to save his life at age 32. And his poor wife, as she understood what was going on, said, "That was a pretty dumb decision for us to come to all the way from Australia just to run this race." You can get too much exercise. I don't recommend anyone run that race. So you can get too much nutrition too. That's why it's moderation in the things that are healthy. How about self-control? Can you get too much self-control? They can't find any undesirable consequences of high self-control. And it's been tested for curvilinearity to see if excessive self-control might produce negative consequences, but no negative patterns have ever been found. And so they say, although in our society there may exist a stereotype of an over-controlled person, one who's overly restrained, cautious, uptight, and not spontaneous, we see no evidence that self-control is to be blamed. But then, and so once again, just emphasizing, you can't get too much self-control. By the way, I think both T's are that way as well. You can't have too much trust in God either. So both T's, we don't have to do them moderately per se. But after this secular team puts together this tremendous review article on temperance, what it does, how great it is for you, how it opens the doors to the psychological good life, they state something rather disappointing. They say relatively little is known about how self-control is acquired and strengthened. This topic must be regarded as a high priority for further research, especially in view of the many benefits that self-control confers. In other words, they say, this is great, but we don't know how to take someone with low self-control and turn them into a person with high self-control. Now, they do give some ideas. This is the same article. Most acts of self-control involve overcoming the incipient response to the immediate situation in order to pursue some greater long-term benefit. Hence, the ability to transcend the immediate situation is crucial. People who live only in the present moment are unlikely to exhibit good self-control, whereas future-mindedness will facilitate self-regulation. In other words, if you're just living only for the moment, here and now, you're going to be like Arnold when it comes to the maid cleaning the house or whatever. You're only living for the present moment. Not good for self-control. But people who have future-mindedness, in other words, they have to have a frontal lobe to be able to reason from cause to effect, and have future-mindedness will facilitate self-regulation. By the way, there's a term, a word that's used repeatedly in the Bible that talks about future-mindedness from a positive perspective. Does anyone know what that word is? When we're looking towards the future from a positive perspective, this should greatly help with self-control, according to the secular sciences. Hope, that's exactly what it is, hope. And of course, there's something in the Bible called the blessed hope. So if we believe in that, that should really help us a lot with self-control. Now, Baumeister has been researching bright lines from Stanford. He says people need bright lines. These really help with self-control. I don't know if you've noticed, but on these Australian roads, they're a little more challenging than our American lanes. Our American lanes are very wide, lots of room for error. You can be distracted and still go down the highway pretty well, as long as you're only distracted for a second or so. But in Australia, you can't get distracted. Those lanes are tight, and there's people right next to you in regards to all those lanes. And so they need bright lines on those lanes. It does help with self-control. And what does he call a bright line? Zero tolerance is a bright line, total abstinence with no exceptions anytime. He says we should have things like that. Zero tolerance. Or abstinence with no exceptions anytime. Now, as mentioned, he teaches psychology at Stanford. Stanford is one of these Ivy League schools. Only the best students in the country get into places like Stanford and Harvard and Yale. And so these students don't have, all of them don't have high self-control. Many of them don't. And when it comes time for the test, since this is a hard college and hard tests, some of them have not prepared very well. And so what do you think Stanford has a problem with? Cheating. Widespread cheating at places like Stanford. And the professors are trying to, make sure these students don't do that. So he had devised a test in such a way, I won't go into the details of it, but it's a brilliant way of devising a computerized test where he could immediately tell if there was cheating going on. And of course, the students are close to each other, so you can kind of lean over and see what's happening there. And so for his first group, he was teaching 3 psychology classes that semester, and it was the same class and the same test that was being administered. And so for the first test, he had them recite the school's honor code. And at Stanford, it talks about academic integrity and not cheating and all of those sorts of things. And so they all read it out loud. They take the test. Widespread cheating. He thought, okay, that didn't work. Let's try for this next group. Let's see if they can just think positively and then have self-control. So he had them recite their 10 most favorite books before they took the test. And they're smiling, they're kind of laughing, they're talking about the books to their fellow classmates that they really liked this book and that book. So he got them thinking positively, and then he had them take the test. Do you think there was cheating? Widespread cheating, even after thinking positively. So now he's feeling pretty bad. What can we do? Is there something else we can do for number 3 test? And so he had them get out the 10 Commandments, put their hand on the Bible, raise their right hand, and read the 10 Commandments. Then he had them take the test. And he found out not one person cheated after that. He says, if you believe that the rule is sacred, a commandment from God, the unquestionable law of a higher power, then it becomes a what? An especially bright line. He's written a book called, his book is called Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength, which he calls willpower. But that gives us a clue how we can have more self-control. But the ultimate solution we'll get to, and I've seen this solution in so many of our programs, and the clue is from the book of Proverbs. It says, he that is slow to anger, if you're slow to anger, you have more self-control, is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit, that means you're managing your emotions, that requires self-control, than he that taketh the city. The commentator on that text says, he has conquered self, the strongest foe man has to meet. The highest evidence of nobility in a Christian is what? Self-control. He who can stand unmoved amid a storm of abuse is one of God's heroes. In fact, that reminds me of a few years ago. We have this Emotional Intelligence Summit every year at Weimar. You're all invited to that. The public is invited, and if you're a physician or a psychologist, you get continuing medical education credits if you're someone in the medical community. But we'll take anyone who wants to learn more about what our emphasis is on emotional intelligence. But one year, we had the entire conference on self-control, and we thought, who better to invite to speak than Roy Baumeister? Well, when you're the #1 quoted researcher, you charge $25,000 per talk. And he said he'd come over for 25 grand. And I said, no, thank you. And instead, we got Professor King. And if you can get this talk, it's one of the greatest talks you'll ever hear, called Self-Control Under Extremely Adverse Circumstances. In other words, he who can stand unmoved amid a what? Storm of abuse. And he went into his personal story of the storm of abuse, but yet having meticulous, comprehensive self-control, and how he was able to accomplish that, and all the good that ended up coming out of that. So it was a great, far better than the talk Baumeister would have given, and it was far less expensive as well. So he who has learned to rule his spirit will rise above the slights, the rebuffs, the annoyances to which we are daily exposed, and these will cease to cast a gloom over his spirit. So it's not like these people aren't going to have issues. They're going to have slights, they're going to have rebuffs, they're going to have annoyances, but they don't get gloomy over those things. Then this profound statement: the man or woman who preserves the balance of the mind when tempted to indulge passion stands higher in the sight of God and heavenly angels than the most renowned general that ever led an army to battle and to victory. Now, this is something that I have found out some Christians don't understand. I've actually had some Christians go to our program that said, I prayed to God that he would do psychic surgery on me so I would never sin again. And I kept on sinning. Who are they blaming? They're blaming God. By the way, why does God never answer a prayer like that? The Bible says God is love. He wants us to love, and if he wants us to love, we have to have free will. And so he's never going to force us, never ever going to force us to do his will. It has to be something that's voluntary. But notice this: when your lower brain is saying, I want to do this, I want to do this, it might feel good, it might taste good, it might whatever. When you're tempted to indulge passion, but you preserve the balance of your mind, what does that mean? That means you're going with your frontal lobe, which what is actually best. So when you're weighing this out, lower passions, going to go with the frontal lobe on what is best for me and what God wants me to do. The angels and God himself are standing up and cheering you when you make those decisions. So there's assistance in self-control. Bright lines help. Worthy goals help. Enhancing the frontal lobe by good music. Slowing down the limbic system in overdrive by even getting rid of some of our screens and Hollywood movies and things that speed up that limbic system and strengthen the lower brain over the front brain. All of those things are helpful. But the fail-safe solution to comprehensive self-control, the key, is found in this little parable, 2 verses given by Christ. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchant man seeking goodly pearls. Why was this merchant man seeking goodly pearls? He wanted to live the good life. Christ and God have no criticism for those wanting to live the good life. But notice, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold how much? All that he had, and bought it. His neighbors thought he had gone nuts. He's selling this. He's selling his car. He's selling his house. He's selling his land. He's giving it all up for just this one piece of property. Has he lost it? In the parable, the pearl is not represented as a gift. The merchant man bought it at the price of all that he had. Many question the meaning of this, since Christ is represented in the scriptures as a gift. He is a gift, but only to those who give themselves soul, body, and spirit to him. How? Without reserve. If you have lack of self-control in an area of your life, you have selfishness in an area of your life, and you've not given it all over to God. When we thus give ourselves wholly to him, Christ, with all the treasures of heaven, gives himself to us. We obtain the pearl of great price. So the key to self-control is actually self-sacrifice. And it's self-sacrificing love. This is a love that the Bible mentions comes from God. The Greek term for it is agape, self-sacrificing love. We have love that's self-serving as humanity, but self-sacrificing has to come from outside of us. God's abounding love and presence in the heart will give the power of self-control and will mold and fashion the mind and character. So the world calls it self-control, but it actually doesn't get mustered up from within. It actually is something that has to come from without. And it comes from without in full measure if we're willing to give our all and put our all on the altar. That self-sacrificing love will give that complete power. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have what? One to another? Love one to another. If we would be true lights in the world, we must manifest the loving, compassionate spirit of Christ. To love as Christ loved means that we must do what? Practice self-control. It means that we must show what? Unselfishness once in a while, at all times, and in all places. So true transformative healing is dependent upon obtaining the pearl. That treasury of jewels of truth is open to all of us. In other words, all of us can have high self-control. Love can change you, it can change me, and it can change the world. Not erotic love, romantic love, or even brotherly love, as good as those loves are in their time and place. It's a love that human nature totally lacks. And that's why it has to come from outside of us. But once you get it, spread it around. Kind words, pleasant looks, little attention, small acts of love, let it flow to others, and it will increase the blessings and happiness of life. And you know, I would like to say, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the church and the Bible workers here, etc., but I did hear someone yesterday talking about people in this church that do this exact thing. They have kind words, they have pleasant looks, they have little attentions, small acts of love. It increases the blessings and happiness of their life and of your life as well. And actually, that's not something they welled up within them. That had to come from outside of them as well. And so you've actually seen God's love working through these people, and that's the reason for this whole seminar series as well, is because they have that love for others, and they want everyone to improve and get that pearl of great price. Here's this, an interesting phrase. Genuine love is a precious attribute of where? Heavenly origin, which increases in fragrance in proportion as it is what? Dispensed to others. So not only can you and I get that love today and get all of it, we can get even more of it tomorrow. How do we get more of it tomorrow? By dispensing it. We become a channel of dispensing that to others. The little attentions, the small acts of love and self-sacrifice that flow out from the life as quietly as the fragrance from a flower, these constitute no small share of the blessings and happiness of life. So I'll close this section with two contrasts in self-control. Paul before Nero. The countenance of the monarch bearing the shameful record of the passions that raged within. Who was that? That was Nero. The countenance of the prisoner telling the story of a heart at peace with God and man. Who was that? Paul. Notice this. The results of opposite systems of education stood that day contrasted. A life of unbounded self-indulgence, that was Nero, and a life of entire self-sacrifice. That was Paul. Here were the representatives of two theories of life: all-absorbing selfishness, which counts nothing too valuable to be sacrificed for what? Momentary gratification. By the way, I've met a number of people like this. Just incredible. I could tell you some stories of it, how even wealthy individuals will put tens of thousands on the line for 20 minutes or less of euphoria. And when you get to know these people, these are some of the most despicable people known to mankind. They are mean, they are angry, they have money, they use it to manipulate people, and they're using it in counting nothing too valuable to be sacrificed for momentary gratification. But in contrast, you can also meet people, and I think you can meet people here, right here at Dundas, that have self-denying endurance, ready to give up even what? Life itself, if need be, for the good of others. That was Paul. And we're told if the soul is to be purified and ennobled and made fit for the heavenly courts, it boils down to two lessons that all of us will need to be learned. What are those two lessons? Self-sacrifice and self-control. That's going to be there for everyone who not only experiences the good life here, but they will experience the extreme good life for eternity, called heaven. So for physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual health to be comprehensive and lifelong, it actually demands the gospel to be complete. And that's what was lacking in 1991. I went to that conference on how to eliminate the number one killer, and I fully believed it would be eliminated within those 25 years. But it's still the number one killer. Why is that? There wasn't anything about how to have self-control. It was what we needed to do, and yes, if we'd done that, it would have happened. And this is the missing element in psychiatry. I actually gave a talk at a secular conference on this very topic, and the room was filled with psychiatrists and psychologists. And they came up afterwards and said, this is the missing element in psychiatry. This is what nobody talks about. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, even politicians won't go there. They won't talk about this. And so humanity continues to have major, major problems because we don't want to talk about the gospel and what it can do to your heart and my heart. But wow, what a difference it can make. I do notice, though, that many of these people criticize what they think is the lowest part of humanity when they don't exercise self-control, even when it could obviously help them. And where I've seen this maybe the most in my GI world is the alcoholic with cirrhosis of the liver. They'll come in with liver toxins sky high, ammonia levels sky high. They're out of their gourd, they're fighting. And the nurses get upset at me because I tell them to put an NG tube down and give them lactulose and neomycin. And they're having to fight as they put this tube down to get rid of the liver toxins, and they often say, Dr. Nedley, why are we doing this for this person? They're just going to go out after we get their toxins all taken care of. They're going to go out and they're going to drink their last liver cell away. And so why do we try to help them when they're not going to even do anything to help themselves? Seems like a rational argument, but I looked at these people far differently. I realized that they didn't want to die. They just didn't know the secret to self-control. Nobody had explained that to them. And when their liver toxins would go down and when their mind would come back, I would then explain to them in simple terms this pearl of great price, the willingness to put all on the altar. And I have had hardcore alcoholics with advanced cirrhosis of the liver go out of that hospital never to drink again. One of them was actually the mother of the receptionist that I ended up hiring. She told me about her Actually, no, it was her. Yeah, it was her mother. There was a grandmother involved too, but it was her, the mother. And she was dying of cirrhosis of the liver, perforated esophageal varices from all that liver pressure building up with the alcohol. And I had to stop the variceal bleeding. And her ammonia level was way up, and she did not have any self-control. But after that discourse, she began to hang out with us, and she had comprehensive self-control, and that was 10 years ago. And she is still living. Her ascites went away, her esophageal varices went away. She even got on a plant-based diet that will also help her. Comprehensive self-control. I'm actually more concerned about people who seem to have it all together, but they have one vice. And they think, you know, I'm still doing pretty well, and I need this, quotes, one vice. But they don't realize that one vice indulged can kill them, and it can also very adversely influence others. So the strongest bulwark of vice is not the iniquitous life of the abandoned sinner, the degraded outcast, like the alcoholic with cirrhosis of the liver. It's the life that otherwise appears virtuous, honorable, and noble, but in which one sin is fostered, one vice indulged. Paul's secret, you know, Paul did not have self-control. He was writing about his own experience in Romans, but he went from low self-control to high self-control. And he boiled it down in 3 words. I what? I die daily. He put his all on the altar for the Lord every day, and he became a transformative influence. We cannot earn salvation, but we are to seek for it with as much interest as perseverance as though we would abandon everything in the world for it. So everyone is searching for the good life, that pearl of great price, but today you know how to start the road that gets there. And I would recommend don't pursue any more substitutes of the good life that doesn't get you there. It's not through any other pathway. I would recommend that you choose comprehensive self-control in your life. Even secular science tells us there's no downside at all to this. Put your all on the altar of sacrifice, because that's how you'll obtain it. Give yourself to God and open your heart to his love. When Paul was being executed as a result of Nero, and you know, I used to kind of wonder in my mind, Nero was such a bad person. And he ended up executing Paul. And, you know, sometimes people question, how can God allow that? But then I was given a perspective recently. God actually loved Nero too. And he thought, if anyone can change Nero, it'll be Paul. Let's have Paul meet Nero. And we're told Nero actually paused and thought, you know what? I would do far better to become a Christian and embrace the gospel. He was thinking about it. But then he thought of his self-indulgence as well and thought, well, I'll have to give up this and I'll have to give up that. And so after he wrote Paul's execution note, and by the way, he normally executed people in public. He did not want Paul executed in public. The reason why is he thought many would become Christians in his Roman Empire if that happened, because Paul had such a great influence. Only 24 people were there at Paul's execution, but many of those ended up becoming Christian just from his warm personality and telling them about the benefits of the gospel in his life. But after that happened, there wasn't hope for Nero anymore. And God withdrew his protection from Nero. And Nero ended up dying shortly thereafter. A very cruel death. Not really caused by God, but caused by those who wanted to take over the Roman Empire from him, etc. And so it's kind of a warning for us. When we come across great people like there are in this Dundas church, don't delay giving your heart to God. There's no downside to doing so, and you can avoid the pathway that Nero went. So right before he was executed, days beforehand, he wrote this to Timothy, who was now going to be the leader. For God gave us a spirit not of what? Fear, but of what? Power and of love. And it's the self-sacrificing love that he mentions, and self-control. Paul put it all there together, the self-sacrifice and the self-control. And that spirit is available to each one of us today. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we know there are many, even here, that are struggling with lack of self-control in an area of their life. We know what benefits could come their way with comprehensive self-control. Help us to realize that your rules of health, your rules for our mind, are far better than us coming up with our own rules that will end up where Nero ended up. But may we be willing to choose self-control and putting ourselves on the altar of sacrifice and accepting your full love, agape love, into each one of our lives. And Lord, as every head is bowed and every eye closed, we pray if there's anyone here that wants to just notify God, I want to choose comprehensive self-control in my life. And I want to have your love and power to help me overcome and experience the good life in its full extent, here in this earth as well as through eternity. Just raise your hand to God and say, God, I'm choosing self-control. And I'm choosing the pathway that gets there. May that gospel move each one that has raised their hand, and I know God will pour out his blessing in comprehensive self-control. Lord, I thank you that even when self-control people mess up, they will go to repair and redemption instead of defensiveness and denial. And may each one of these people continue to improve along the pathway of sanctification that leads to your throne. Give them your blessing of the good life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.